Who was Tiddy Mun? Why is he one of the most important figures in English folklore? And how is it that he was nearly forgotten forever? Hi everybody, I'm Nick and this is Beasts of the Old World, a channel that explores ancient folklore and mythical creatures from across the globe. If you're fascinated by the mysterious and the unseen, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. Once, long ago, there was a name whispered across the marshy wetlands of eastern England. A name spoken by the birds and woven into the reeds. A name that bubbled quietly, softly, just beneath the surface of the waters. That name was Tiddy Mun. His is a story almost lost forever, remembered now by precious few people. The story of a once revered king, the ruler of a group of marsh spirits, unnervingly known as the Strangers. But who was this curious and forgotten king? And what did he look like? Though indeed a king, Tiddy Mun was anything but regal. No taller than a 3-year-old child, his frail frame was ever wrapped in tattered grey cloth, his long white beard wild and knotted like the twisting reeds of the fenlands. He moved with a heavy limp, as though the weight of great age, or of sorrow too vast to name, pulled at his every step. Only at dusk, when the marshes lay still and the mists began to creep in, might you have glimpsed him, shifting softly through the fog. His arrival was always marked by the mournful cry of the lapwing, a sound as old and lonely as the marshes themselves. Despite his small and weathered form, Tiddy Mun carried the strength of the Fens in his hollowed hands. People believed he held the power to lower the rising marsh waters, sparing homes and fields from disaster. He was their protector. Whenever the floodwaters rose, threatening to drown the land and ruin homes, the fenfolk would gather at the cresting of the first new moon and offer water to the dykes while chanting his name in desperate, reverent pleas.
Tiddy Mun without an end, the waters soak the earth again.
If their cries were answered by the distant call of the lapwing, also known as the Peewit bird, they knew that by the dawn the waters would relent. Such was the way of things for hundreds of years, until one day, when everything changed. Today, few remember Tiddy Mun, and his story is one that might have been forgotten forever. Were it not for a single, very detailed account from Marie Clotilde Balfour in 1891, linked in the description in its entirety, we would almost certainly have never heard of him. Yet, through this testimony, we have a glimpse into this spirit's significance, and it would seem that Tiddy Mun was revered by the fenfolk for countless generations. So how is it that a figure central to the rituals and culture of an entire region could disappear almost overnight? Today, this place is called Lincolnshire, whose countryside is a vast quilt of ordered fields and wolds stretching endlessly towards the horizon. It's easy to think that this image of quintessential British countryside is the natural environment untouched and preserved. Yet, in reality, this is a landscape entirely tamed and shaped by human hands. As beautiful as this place is today, and to borrow again from Legends of the Cars, I'm more concerned at present with memories of the cars as they once were, a wild, desolate, dreary marsh full of strange sights and sounds. For that is indeed the history of this carefully crafted patchwork of fields. Beneath it is a world lost to time, a world of winding waterways, tangled marshes, and treacherous bogs. The wild and untamed Fens. The waters here have long since retreated, leaving behind a land that bears no trace of the savage beauty it once held, or of the spirits who once walked its shrouded paths. The Fens were once a vast and unpredictable realm of water and mist, their shifting tides both a blessing and a curse. Life here was difficult, precarious, but utterly dependent upon the landscape. Fishermen, reed cutters and hunters, indeed all the fenfolk, lived by the marsh's rhythms, bound to its moods as tightly as the roots of the water plants that cradled their fragile homes. The marshes sustained them for hundreds of years, shaping a unique culture within the region, and a people who worked with the land, not against it. That is, until King Charles I ordered Dutch engineers, experts of land reclamation, to drain the fens to make way for more profitable farmland. Despite enormous local opposition, it was not long before straightened rivers and deep-cut dikes began to carve up the landscape, draining and transforming the watery fens into fertile farmland. While the fenfolk knew this would likely bring wealth and prosperity in time, it would do so, they feared, at a terrible cost. And, sure enough, the fenfolk's ancient way of life slowly began to drain away with the marshes, swallowed by the very earth they once worked with in harmony. As the water levels dropped and dribbled away, the fenfolk shook their heads and said to each other that the king had sought to master what should never have been mastered. They feared that it wasn't just their livelihoods that were being destroyed, but that the draining of the fens had disturbed something far older, something far more dangerous. By firelight, the fenfolk whispered about spirits turned evil, of the strange lights flickering in the dark, and of distant moaning cries echoing across the marsh. Those who were brave, or foolhardy enough, to venture out at night did not do so lightly, clutching their charms as they went, hoping desperately to avoid the attentions of these tricksy marsh spirits, now grown malevolent. It was said that the dead would call from the waters, whispering to travellers to "Come closer, my child, and would you care to join me down here?" You could see their pale faces hovering just below the surface of the murky waters, and they would send up little lights, pale flames flickering on the surface to guide the unwary deep into the marsh before wrapping them up in a fog so thick that they might never find their way out. It's said that they even once managed to trap the moon herself, burying her so deep in the ground that she was only saved by a happy chance. Worse still were the dead hands, monstrous disembodied hands that would wait in the mists for travellers to approach, then scuttle like spiders and pounce upon their victims, dragging them down to their watery graves. The fenfolk didn't fear losing these hellish creatures, of course, but there were other fenland spirits for whom they held great reverence and respect. Preeminent among these was Tiddy Mun. When the King of England, Charles I, sought to carve the fenlands into ordered fields, replacing its wide, meandering waterways with straight canals, its natural rhythms with rigid lines, the marshlands began to die. The fenfolk feared that draining the fens would drive Tiddy Mun away. After all, without Tiddy Mun, who would keep the waters at bay when they rose? Whenever they'd called upon him, Tiddy Mun had always answered. When the fens were draining away, Tiddy Mun answered once more, only this time it was not with mercy, but with vengeance. This is the story from that time of great change, telling not only of the last days of Tiddy Mun, but also of the beginning of the end of the fenlands themselves, and the lost fenfolk who once lived there.
Life was hard out in the fens, for they suffered with a shivering sickness back then, shaking and supping gin or nibbling opium to ease their aches. They knew it were the marshes that brought the sickness, but when word came that the land had been drained, they weren't very keen. Bad's bad, they said, but meddling's worse. For there were naught to be done about it. Orders for the work came direct from the king, Charles the First of his name. He were bringing in Dutchmen to do the job. Clever with water, them, but knowing nought of the fens and what lived there. The fens, you see, was full of spirits. There was boggarts, who could be mighty tricksy at the best of times, and what would turn nasty at even the smallest of offences. And there was will-o'-the-wikes who delighted in leading folk astray into the waters with their lantern lights, and there was Todd Lowry's aside, and things far worse, which will not do to speak of. When travelling through the marshes, folk carried witches' pink with 'em and Bible balls to keep 'em safe, for all the good it might do 'em. When the Dutchies arrived, folk wouldn't give 'em bed nor board, nor even a kind word. See, the fenfolk lived off the marshes. Their fishing, hunting and reed cutting all depended on. Draining the fens might cure the shivering sickness, aye, but it'd take their way of life wi' it. And worse, they feared it'd anger the bog spirits, creatures what wouldn't take kindly to seeing their bogs and waterholes dried out. And so it was that by day the Dutchies toiled, and by night the fenfolk crept out and tore down all they'd built. But though the fenfolk were frightful scared of these spirits, it wasn't fear that drove them to act. For there was one spirit, chief of the bogs, whose name they said was Tiddy Mun, if a name it was at all. He weren't cruel like the water elves, nor evil like the dead hands that had dragged folk down to drown in the depths, but still his laugh, a sharp, screechy thing, set folk a-shivering. On a winter's night, if you heard it by your door, you'd huddle close to the fire and whisper, "Hearken to Tiddy Mun." When the wet season came, and the waters rose covering the fields and reaching doorsteps, the fenfolk would all call upon him. At the first new moon, they'd all step out, looking over the bog and cry, "Tiddy Mun, we out a name, the waters soak the earth again." Trembling, they'd wait for the lapwing cry, the sign that Tiddy Mun had heard their calls, and held their breath till it sounded from the swamp. Come morning, sure enough, the waters had begone. See, the fenfolk trusted in Tiddy Mun, and saw no need for any Dutchy meddling. They had a rhyme for him, and would often say, "Tiddy Mun, we out a name, White Heed, Walking Lane. While the water teems the fen, Tiddy Mun'll harm no men." But that were the problem. The water were no longer teeming. The meres was slowly draining, and the bog holes was turning to solid earth. Soon, if the Dutchies carried on meddling, there'd be no place for Tiddy Mun to live. The fenmen feared this, and feared his anger more so. But always more Dutchies came, and they worked and they worked, and they grafted and toiled, and soon the fens was drained. The bog spirits was found to be vanished. All the boggarts, the will-o'-the-wisps, the Todd Lowrys, and even Tiddy Mun himself, it seemed, were gone. At first, folk rejoiced, for the land could now be farmed, and that were sure to bring wealth and prosperity. But it weren't long afore trouble brewed. It fell upon the Dutchmen first. One by one they began to vanish, never again to be found. The fenmen knew who'd taken them, and began to tremble, fearing what might befall them next. And soon it was that cows died, pigs starved, ponies went lame, and milk curdled. Thatched roofs sagged and walls cracked. The fenfolk lost the marsh wildlife they'd hunted and relied upon, and children and elders fell sick and dwindled away. Hunger stalked the land. At first, the fenfolk could not believe that their very own Tiddy Mun could have brought such misery upon them, and in their desperation they blamed witches and todlowries. They wore charms against the todlowries, and they stoned and near drowned the witches, but it made no difference. What good were blaming todlowries when it seemed they'd all gone with the marshes? At last, when the graveyard was full, and the cribs and cradles lay empty, a new moon rose. Looking out upon it, the fenfolk remembered Tiddy Mun, and it was decided that they must try and placate him. It was agreed that at the next new moon they would all come together, as they'd once done, down at the cross dyke by the new river. And so it was that the fenfolk crept there through the dark, each carrying a bucket of fresh water. Standing by the new dyke, under the new moon, they emptied their buckets into the dyke and cried as loud as they could in one voice, "Tiddy Mun without a name, here's water for thee, make the spell undone." They waited long in the silence. Then came a sound, what seemed to come from everywhere and yet nowhere at the same time. A great wailing and crying, so mournful it set teeth on edge. Mothers swore that they could hear the cries of their own lost little ones weeping for them from beyond the grave, and others said that they felt cold lips kiss them upon their cheeks, and could hear the fluttering of soft wings all about them, though naught could be seen. And so it was that they thought that the dead children were petitioning to Tiddy Mun to lift his curse, to show mercy, and leave those yet alive to live and to thrive. Then, as sudden as it started, the wailing stopped, and the lapwing's cry came soft from across the river. And folk knew that Tiddy Mun had heard their calls and had forgiven them. From then on, the land that had once been the Fens thrived once more, and a great prosperity came to the folk who dwelt there. But they never forgot what had happened. At every new moon, they took water to the dyke edge and poured it out, saying, "Tiddy Mun without a name, here's some water for your game." The lapwing's cry always answered, but Tiddy Mun himself was never seen again.
Writing in 1891, Marie Clotilde Balfour notes that in the few small fens that still remained then,
when the mists rise at dusk in shifting wreaths, and the bleak wind from the North Sea moans and whistles across the valley, it is not difficult to people the cars once more with all the uncanny dwellers whose memory is preserved in the old stories. At all times, it seems a fit resting place for the last days of a dying mythology.
If Mrs. Balfour's account in Legends of the Cars is to be believed, then to the people of the Fens, Tiddy Mun was more than just a folk tale. He was the voice of the marshlands themselves, a spirit shaped by water and wind, by mud and mist. His myth, underscoring the importance of maintaining balance and harmony with the environment, is just as important as it ever was. That his aid comes when people honour the natural order, while his wrath follows when it is disrupted, is an unsettling reminder of the duality of nature, beautiful and bounteous, while also brutal and uncompromising. The rhyme associated with Tiddy Mun, half forgotten like the marshes he once guarded, illustrates this duality clearly. Tiddy Mun without a name, white heed walk in lane, while the water teems the fen, Tiddy Mun'll harm no men. The Tiddy Mun myth likely emerged as a way for the people of the Fens to make sense of the challenging and often precarious environment in which they lived. The wetlands of the Fens were unpredictable and dangerous, with rising waters threatening homes and livelihoods. A myth like Tiddy Mun gave agency to the marshes, allowing people a sense of control over their environment through rituals and offerings. His association with the new moon reflected the cycles of nature. Myths like this often align with observable patterns, providing a framework for rituals that coincide with natural rhythms such as the receding of floodwaters, reminding people that balance, above all else, is essential. But balance is fragile, and so too can be memory. The fenfolk knew that nature's gifts are fleeting, and that kindness and wrath often wear the same face. The image of an old, limping figure, wise and yet vulnerable, frail but indomitable, helpful and yet capable of great wrath, reflected the capricious nature of the untamed earth, as well as our complex relationship with it. And while we can take a strong environmental message from this myth, that's not the only reason I believe it to be so important. In a number of ways, the Tiddy Mun story encapsulates the very reason I began this channel in the first place. It's what his story reveals about us, and how fragile our place in history really is. You may have noticed that throughout this episode I've spoken of Tiddy Mun only in the past tense, and there's a reason for that. In our world of dry homes and electric lights, where streetlights light your way at night, where rivers are hemmed in by concrete, and where seasons can pass almost unnoticed behind double-glazed windows, it's easy to forget spirits like Tiddy Mun. It's easy to forget the stories told about them, as well as the messages contained within those stories. For many of us, the intimate relationship with the earth once experienced by people like the fenfolk is all but extinguished. Tiddy Mun may no longer be the centre of a way of life, but his story endures, a window onto a time, a place, and a people now utterly lost to us. His tale stands as a living memory of the fenfolk, a people who lived in rhythm with their land, bound to the marshes that sustain them, and now a vanished culture whose world disappeared entirely. And it wasn't because of war or famine, nor were their beliefs erased, as is so often the case, by religious zealotry. Instead, it was the slow, relentless march of human progress, manifest in this case by the great engineering achievement that was the draining of the fens. The world that they relied upon quite literally disappeared from beneath their feet. When the waterways were reshaped and the wild marshes tamed, an entire ecosystem was lost. So too were the people who lived there and their culture. And yet, though his habitat and those who revered him are gone forever, the story of Tiddy Mun endures. This, for me, is the reason the Tiddy Mun myth remains as one of the most important in English folklore. His story, fragile but enduring, says something of the power of folklore in general, and of the importance of storytelling. It's important to remember these stories, not just for their moral messaging or for psychological insights, but also for their cultural and historical significance, and for the warnings that they carry across time. Though he may have the look of a harmless, tiny old man, you forget Tiddy Mun at your peril. We saw his wrath upon the draining of the Fens, and though it may seem to have made little difference in the grand scheme of things, for of course the draining went ahead and the Fens were destroyed, but Tiddy Mun may well have been playing a much longer game. The success of the initial draining of the Fens was short-lived. Soon after the work's completion, the drained land began to sink, and it wasn't long before it had sunk lower than the rivers themselves. By the end of the century, the land was underwater once again. 100 years later, with the help of coal-powered steam engine pumps, the Fens were extensively drained once more. This time, it seemed, for good. But even today, the drained peatlands of Lincolnshire are still slowly sinking, a result of oxidation and soil degradation, leaving the area increasingly vulnerable to flooding. Today, embankments and pumping stations highlight the fragility of this long-reclaimed land as the earth gradually collapses in upon itself and slowly settles back into the shape it naturally wants to be. This has given rise to a new, or rather old, way of thinking about marshlands. Marshes, of course, hold a lot of water, and the wide, meandering rivers that nature gives us hold much more water than their straighter, more engineered, man-made cousins, providing greater natural defence against flooding. Projects like the Great Fen recognise this and aim to restore parts of the Fens to their former state, with the further hope of inviting back the native fenland wildlife and rhythms that once defined the region. Perhaps Tiddy Mun is having the last laugh after all. For in this, Tiddy Mun is emblematic of a single question asked by two separate worlds: the ancient world of the fenfolk and our modern industrialised one. Is it better to shape the world to our will, or adapt ourselves to the world around us? This question invites us to look closer, not just at the land, but at the way we live upon it. It urges us to uncover what was lost, not just marshes and creatures, but a culture and a way of life, a worldview that saw nature as alive, interconnected and sacred. Tiddy Mun's myth stands as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the cost of progress and the need for balance, echoing the voices of a vanished people and a lost environment. But it is more than just a warning. It's an invitation to remember. And we must remember, because if we forget where we came from, how can we ever hope to make sense of who we are today? How can we even make a guess of where we're going? Without myths like this, we are stumbling around blindly in the dark. So, when you next look out over the marshes and the mists roll in thick, when the land is bathed in the gloaming's eerie half-light, and the lapwing's cry echoes across the still, reedy waters, remember Tiddy Mun. These creatures, these stories, only survive if they mean something to us. If they don't, they simply fade away. This story, despite hailing from a region and a people completely gone from the earth, means something. And through it, we might yet be able to restore something of what was lost to us, and maybe, just maybe, be guided towards a more sustainable future. Thank you for joining me on this journey into Eastern England's mythic past. If you enjoyed the video and want to help keep these stories alive, be sure to like, subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss another episode. Next week we're retelling the classic folktale of the Fens, The Dead Moon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you want to become a legend yourself, you can now join the channel to support it directly. Click the join button to find out more about membership offers. So what did you think of this story? And are there other forgotten legends you'd like us to uncover? Please let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep a wary eye out for the strangers who hide in the mists and the dead hands of the marshes. where the beasts of the old world still roam wild today.